So today we are going to talk about some compression and dynamics. And I, what we've gone up till this point is, again, I talked about in my opening how I sort of break this down into these five classes into a very compartmentalized approach in terms of like the step by step that a mix engineer would take as they're moving a project from just getting it to finishing it. And so, as the first day we took a look at some room calibration and some things that can help us make better decisions. And then we moved into yesterday where we did a little bit of rebalancing, thought a little bit about left to right, but then also prepared ourselves to move forward to, do some of that low end removal, some of the modeling of what's there and all of that. And I did mention how that low end removal also sets us up for a bit more success when we start to deal with the dynamic control, because when we have something like a compressor that is responding to the input level in some way, the threshold is, listening to what's coming into it, right? We we're making sure that we're creating just the emphasis that's what's left in the sound by removing the low end. That's what we're going to be wanting to address. If we do want to address it with dynamic control stuff, we at least have kind of cleaned up that low end, because one more time I'm going to say it, and I'll probably say it at least 5 times every day we're here this week. That low end takes up a lot of energy and a lot of room. So that removal helps us when we start to then set the compression and all of that stuff. Now, most of the time today, compression is used for, well, most of the time ever, compression is used for two main purposes. One is sort of the basic dynamic control compression that you think about when you think about a compressor. Something is too loud, you use a compressor to kind of keep it a little bit lower, type of a scenario. But one of the things is that as we've gotten more and more into sample placement production, velocity control production, MIDI production over the last few years, there's less and less of that sort of overall dynamic control compression being needed. Because if you think about it, like if I program a hi-hat and then I go in and I adjust the velocities how I want them, I'm sort of compressing it ahead of time. I'm leveling out the differences between them. When I do the kick drum, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I make sure that all the velocities are the right, consistent uh, level, then I've sort of, in essence, controlled the dynamics of that kick drum at its source, right? So when we deal with that, I find it's a little bit less and less in that traditional approach, but certainly valuable. But one of the other ways that I find that I'm using compression a significant amount lately is across this other plane, which is a little bit more about kind of shaping that sound in its place. In other words, amongst its time, that whether it's a kick, however long the kick lasts, or the snare, or whatever, I don't know if I'm drawing that right, but a kick would be like that, or it might or like that. um, but I can, shape that along its own time. So there's sort of two different ways that I think about using compression and dynamics plugins today. So I'm going to roll through some pretty simple basic stuff here, and I might go a little bit quick. Uh, but, as usual, the notes are going to be in a bit more detail. But the overall idea here is that we're talking about the dynamic range. So we call them compressors in a lot of cases, and then they're also often called dynamics plugins. I hear some music or something. Oh, is it cool if I mute you, Nick? Oh, there we go. So we're dealing with the dynamic range ultimately, and what that is talking about is the loudest part of the signal against the lowest part of the signal. So if we look at this, for example, let's say this is a kick drum or a snare sample, the dynamic range is where it's loudest and then where it's lowest. And of course, this center line is like it doesn't go lower necessarily below the center line. It's just gonna kind of do this around the center line, right? But basically, compression plugins or dynamics plugins kind of work on the dynamic range and that difference between the loudest and softest. Now, they work in a couple of different ways, but one of the things that I think about is that specifically for that traditional use of compression, I kind of think And some people will ask me like, well, how do I know when I need to use a compressor, right? So here's an important little distinction is I sort of think to myself, like, what is happening there? Like something doesn't sound right. Like if I'm listening to, for example, I'll use the example of the hi-hat program. So I'm listening to a hi-hat track and it's going, and it's like, it just feels like some parts are too loud or too soft, or like something becomes distracting. Like, so if I find myself thinking, if I'm listening to a vocal as an example, and all of a sudden I think, oh, what happened there? Like, why did that word drop too low? Or why is that too loud? Then there's my clue to potentially need to do some sort of dynamic control. um, Different thinking than like, oh, the vocal seems too bassy, or you know what I mean? It's like I'm not so much thinking about where it sits across the frequency range. Like I can't hear it overall because it doesn't have enough brightness to it or something. It's more about like what's happening, the difference between what's happening between certain sections. So some words are louder, some words are softer, or some piece of whatever's being played, maybe a lead that's played in, and then not necessarily dealt with any sort of velocity changing or whatever, where some notes might be a little louder, a little softer, and I might feel like that's distracting in some way. Not that some dynamics aren't totally useful. I mean, obviously, we want something to feel organic and nice, and and all of that. But again, if I feel like, ooh, what happened there? If I say to myself, oh, what happened there? Like, what's going on? Then in the volume, and then that's when I think of using the dynamic range. So compression is the sort of standard way of using that in its old school context, in a sense of decreasing the dynamic range. A compression sort of works from the top down, right? It's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. When something is there, the compressor knocks it back into place, and that's kind of how that works. We also I'm going to talk about expansion really quickly because expanders expand the dynamic range in some way. So they might take the signal and say, once you reach this certain level, we're going to make you louder, or they might say, once you start to decline to a certain point, we're going to make you lower. For example, like a gate would be. Now, expanders and gates are not something that I've used very regularly in the digital realm, because the example of a gate which says, once you're coming down, I'm going to take you down all the way to expand the dynamic range. So a gate is an expander in a sense. I would just edit that out, right? So I'm not, you know, in a world where I'm kind of using gates and expanders, but that understanding for me, I don't know how many years it was before I knew what the heck an expander did. So we will, cover that a little bit so you understand it, but it's not necessarily something that I even use a whole lot. It's, normal kind of top-down compression is a lot of the way we are using nowadays, right? Um, so we also have another way of decreasing the dynamic range or compressing the dynamic range, which is this sort of upward compression or from the bottom up compression. Um, a lot of normal compression plugins don't necessarily have that as a way of working, but uh, some multiband compressions give you the ability to work from the bottom up. For example, the multiband dynamics processor has the ability to set a bottom that works either bottom up or bottom down. So it can work as an expander, bottom down, or an upward compressor, bottom up. And so you can kind of set two thresholds, which we'll then get into, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. But that's some basic overview of kind of what we're dealing with. The rest of the actual settings that we interact with, regardless of the DAW, pretty much regardless of what plugin you're using, although they might be called different things, there's a few standard sets of parameters, knobs. And I'm going to quickly go through what they're each designed to be in charge of, and then how they interact with one another. So basically, on a compressor, I'm sure we're all familiar with the threshold, right? So the threshold is the point at which it says, here's where this compression is going to start. So the threshold sets where the compression is going to start. And on this particular plugin, the threshold is set with this little triangle over here. We've all seen that and done that. But other compressors work a little differently, but ultimately what the threshold is doing is it's saying at which point we're going to start to do the compression, at which point that game of whack-a-mole is going to start. Now, the compression, or the threshold, sorry, the threshold is listening to the input, right? So the signal is coming in and the threshold is listening to that. Now, a lot of compressors nowadays have the ability to switch between listening to the peak input or listening to the RMS input. For example, the RMS is like the average input. So, just a real quick definition on that is that the peak is going to move a lot faster, the peak is going to hit louder, and the RMS is going to move slower, and it's going to not quite be as loud. So I'll show you the interaction of that and what we mean in a little while after the definition. We'll apply some of this, but that's the difference between peak and RMS. And what that means is that's how the threshold is listening to the input. Okay. So the threshold, if we take a look at that sort of diagram from earlier where we've got the dynamic range here being the top, the threshold sets a point at which below it everything will be reduced. So it's like that whack-a-mole, right? So like as soon as the mole comes up or the signal comes above the threshold, it gets pushed back down. So the threshold is listening to the input, and when the threshold gets crossed or exceeded or passed, whatever you want to call it, it then says, "Okay, it's time to compress." Right now, attack is responsible for saying when that compression is going to occur. So a fast attack means that compression is going to start fast. So threshold says it's time to go, and attack says either now or a little bit later, right? So attack moves the start time of the actual compression. Ratio determines how much the compression is going to happen, okay? Now ratio has some numbers, and in a lot of cases you'll see this sort of 4:1. Uh, and so what these numbers mean is that a 4-to-1 ratio says that it's going to take 4 dBs over the threshold for the compressor to only allow 1 dB over the threshold. Okay, so 4-to-1 means it's going to take 4 dBs over me to just let one through. If you increase me by 8 dBs, I'm only going to let two through. Right, so 4-to-1 ratio is sort of a mild ratio. 2-to-1 says, okay, it's going to take 2 dBs over. I'm only going to let you go by one. In other words, I'm only reducing you by half, right? 2-to-1. 4-to-1, I'll reduce you by a quarter. 8-to-1, I'll reduce you by an eighth. It'll take 8 dBs over for me to let you go only one. So a higher number to one ratio, like 8-to-1, 10-to-1, 12-to-1, means more compression. So that's kind of what that does and what that determines. And then release determines when and how fast the compressor lets go. So the signal comes in, threshold says, I've been exceeded, go, we're good to go. Attack says, okay, we're going to do it now. Ratio says, this is how much we're going to do it. And then when threshold gets not exceeded any longer, the signal is backs away from the threshold, right? Then it says to release, okay, it's time to let go. And then release is determining how fast or how slow that's going to occur. All right. So it's kind of like if someone comes up to you, it's like if we think about two people that are going to embrace in like a hug, right? It's like when you get close enough to hug, it's like, okay, it's time to hug. How how hard the hug is going to be, or how is the ratio? Like I'm going to squeeze you a lot or squeeze you a little, and then when it's time to let go, when you notice that person trying to leave, it's like how slow are you going to awkwardly slow, like Will Ferrell would let go of a hug, or you're going to let go with a fast release, right? So that's what the if we think about the way a compressor is hugging the audio, this is kind of what's going on. Now those controls and that understanding of those basic four controls is going to take your understanding of compression through any plugin, because those relationships are going to be the same regardless of whether you're using a multiband version or a regular version or a UAD version. Compression, attack, ratio, release, threshold work pretty much the same. There's some differences with certain products, but ultimately behind the scenes, it's working in the same way. So putting a little context to what that is doing. There's a few other parameters that we see commonly. Auto release simply is working off of two releases. So remember, we've got the release that says when we're going to let go and how fast or slow that's going to let go, right? A fast release lets go quickly, a slow release gently lets go of the compression. Auto release is kind of working across two planes. So initially, it's like quickly letting go most of it and then slowly letting go the rest. One of the things that's cool is that auto release can be kind of transparent because it's going to kind of, you know, clamp the clamping down that's occurring from the compression is happening, and then auto release when it's time to release will sort of let a little bit go quickly, and so it'll be a little bit less noticeable, and then the rest will sort of ease out, right? So I do like auto release a lot. That's kind of what it's doing. The knee controls how the threshold is responding to that input, or how it's listening and how the compression starts. So the knee changes the shape of the listening ears of the threshold in a sense. So it talks about the I'm going to show you this now. Actually, I'm not going to wait to get to it. Actually, I will explain this a little bit later. So the knee basically opens up the area at which the threshold is listening. So it's listening to a little bit sooner. So in other words, it's like getting prepared. It's kind of like when you see that person coming in from that hug, you're starting to anticipate a hug is coming, right? So that's sort of the way that the knee allows you to anticipate that hug coming. In other words, it's able to anticipate the compression is about to happen, and sort of opens up the point at which the threshold says it's time to start compressing. The makeup gain is just basically relevels the output settings, after the compression. So those are the rest of the sort of common settings. So one of the things that can sometimes be confusing is people will say, well, how do I set the makeup gain, right? So here's just how I do it is I look at the gain reduction meter, whatever that is, or whether it's gain reduction number, or kind of look at the meter and try to estimate how much is happening depending on the plugin itself. And I notice the amount of compression that seems to be applied, gain reduction or compression. And then I set the makeup to about half of the amount of compression that I see. And that usually seems to be about right because the compression gain reduction is usually kind of moving like this. And so I kind of figure out if that's 4 dBs or 5, I'll set the makeup gain around 2. And that gives me a good way to kind of bypass it to hear what the compression is doing. Auto makeup gain kind of sets the output level at a certain amount, regardless of what the amount of compression you're doing. And so it can be useful on some compressors. I don't particularly like the implementation. Oh, it's not here, but I don't particularly like the implementation of the auto makeup on this particular compressor. In some cases, it's useful, but a lot of times it just makes it too loud. Because, like I said, auto makeup usually has a set output level, and it makes sure that everything kind of stays there. So here's another funny little analogy, and one of the other instructors, Adam from IO Academy, had sent me this a few months ago, but I just thought that this was kind of funny. Uh, Threshold is the maximum volume you can play your music until your mom, the compressor, comes in and tells you to turn it down. Ratio is how far you turn it down after your mom yells at you. Attack is how fast you move to turn it down once mom starts pounding at the door. And release is how long you wait for her to leave before you turn it back up. So it's a quick little analogy there. Now, the piece of understanding here is how there's an interaction of all of these knobs, or several of them at least. Mainly, like if we think about the amount of compression that's defined by the ratio, for example, a higher ratio means more compression, right? So 4-to-1 compression, we talked about that. 4 dBs over, I'll let 1. 8-to-1 compression means it'll take 8 dBs over before I let it up 1, right? So increasing the amount of threshold, or sorry, increasing the amount of ratio will create more compression. But also lowering the threshold so it starts to compress sooner will show more compression. So there's this interaction that occurs. Now, the reason I like to sort of, throw that out there is because of the way that I also like to work, where I think about, for example, if I want a little bit more compression, I'll usually work across both of those planes oftentimes. So I will jump in and say, oh, I want a little more compression, and I might take the ratio up a little bit, like say up 1 more dB, or one more, whatever, from 4-to-1 to 5-to-1, and maybe bring the threshold down just a little bit. So because I know that that interaction is both going to achieve a little bit more compression, I might, I usually will work across both of those parameters to kind of achieve the same result. Getting a little bit faster attack means the compression is going to start a little sooner, will also show the result of more gain reduction. And so, moving the attack a little bit later means the compression is going to start a little bit later. That also will do a little bit less compression, even though you could also bring up the threshold or bring down the ratio, right? So there's this interaction between these parameters. And sometimes I think across two planes when I'm trying to address it. So when I think about the shaping of the sound, which is an important part of my workflow, I use compressors a lot to help me address the way that sound is traveling through time, like the shape of that sound, kind of like adjusting an ADSR on a synth sound. Some of you might be familiar with those controls. I can actually use a compressor to help sort of do a little bit of shaping around that relationship. In other words, how that sound is traveling through time. And so a couple of things to keep in mind is that the attack time affects the shape of the sound. So a faster attack will smooth out some of the transients or soften some of the first part of a sound. A slower attack will increase the impact because it's going to let a little bit more of the first part of the sound through. Okay. So the attack time affects the shape of the sound. The release time can affect the tone or the excitement. So a faster release time. So in other words, the compression is letting go really quickly, you sort of can let some of the later part of the sound through a little bit more. It can be a little bit more noticeable. A slow release time can be more smooth, kind of more transparent. Auto release, which I talked about, works quickly at first and then slowly, is very transparent and works really nice for very dynamic material, like, for example, vocals. And then we have time-based release times. Now, what the hell does that mean, JJ? Well, if we look at release times on compressors are usually defined in what? Milliseconds. Well, a millisecond has a period of time related to our tempo of a song or a selection on our screen, right? Again, just like the way I was talking about how note frequency, octave is also related to frequencies as we're EQing and as we're thinking about setting filters and the 12 dB slope, we also have this sense of time when we think about attack time, release time on compressors. Now, this took me a really long time to kind of understand until I sort of started to put some context to it. And this was really helpful to me to look at this quick little definition of how to figure out what is like a quarter note, eighth note, or a 16th note, because I was a little bit familiar with those time definitions just from programming drums. I knew what a 16th note, eighth note, and quarter note was. But when it came to setting compressors, I had no relational experience to get like what's the difference? Like how does that those how do those milliseconds relate to what I'm doing. So here's an example of taking a look at 120 bpm example calculations. A quarter note equals 500 milliseconds, eighth note 250 milliseconds, a 16th note equals 125 milliseconds. So just sort of keeping this in your mind, and you can see how a 16th note at 110 beats per minute is 136 milliseconds, eighth note, quarter note, right? So once I sort of got this and just sort of understood a little bit of that relationship between the millisecond and my actual grid, and when I thought about the rhythm of the part that I'm programming or wanting to compress, it sort of helped me understand a little bit more of this release setting. For the longest time, you watch YouTube videos or you read stuff or whatever the case may be, and people, use these terms like fast attack, slow release. And it's like, well, what is a slow release? Like in the beginning, I had no idea what that meant. Is it 10 milliseconds? Is it 500 milliseconds? Like, what do you mean by a slow release? And I started to realize that what they're talking about it's in relationship to like the tempo and the rhythm of your song. So these milliseconds start to mean something. So here's a little bit more on the way the release time affects the excitement, and then also some sort of simple example settings. We're going to do more example settings here in a little bit, so I'll just sort of leave that in there for you. And then here's a little bit more on the knee, because we just sort of went over that, but this takes us a little bit deeper into that. So, what's called a soft knee, or a higher number knee, I guess, technically, is it allows the compressor to be a little bit more transparent because what's happening is the compression starts a little bit sooner. So here's where I'll show you how that works. And it's pretty easy to see. It might not be easy for you guys to see on this screen, but I'll show you. So if you can see here, and here's my knee, right? So if I bring my knee to 0, do you notice how there's those two outside lines around there? Like if I zoom, you guys, can you see, did that zoom? Can somebody tell me if that zoomed? I don't think it did. Did it zoom? No? No. Okay, sorry. All right. Well,
No,
all right. So you guys will play with this. I'll show you though. The knee control, we see how we have a 0 knee is allowing me to set my threshold wherever I set my threshold. And it's like, that's the defining factor. There's where the game of whack-a-mole occurs, right? If I increase the knee, do you notice how there's two white lines that are opening up around that? Basically, what that is saying is that the compression is going to occur a little bit before the threshold and a little bit after the threshold. And that's what those white lines represent. So the knee is sort of softening this curve or creating a little bit more compression starting sooner and finishing later. So whereas with no knee, it's a set line of that threshold. And as I move the threshold around, the compression starts based on input and just compresses. As I increase the knee, it allows the compressor to start a little sooner and then increase until it reaches full compression a little bit later. So it is a smoother way of kind of doing some compression. Sorry, I meant to try to mute myself for my cough, but I pressed play instead. All right, so that's kind of the way that the knee works. It's not quite the same, but can have a little bit of a similar reaction in that I talked about the way the RMS detection, because it's listening to the average of the input, right? So the input is coming in at one level at the peaks, which are moving faster and kind of doing this type of thing. But the average level, this average input, is a little bit slower moving. And so the compression is a little slower moving. So it's a little bit more transparent compression. So, increasing the knee is also sort of working similarly. Um, and that's sort of like the original way of using these tools, because it's only in the last couple of years where the ability for a compressor to listen to the average input was implemented. In there's no hardware compressors that I know of that work off of an RMS input. This is a digital phenomenon, or at least in the last few years that's occurred. But um, yeah, so I pretty much covered that peak and RMS difference there. Um, All right, so a limiter is an extreme ratio. So a limiter is just basically a compressor on steroids. We talked about the ratio being a 4-to-1 ratio, says it's going to take 4 dBs before I can go over 1. If you can imagine infinite to 1, that's the equivalent of a limiter. Okay, so now this here. This compression sidechain part. Now, probably many of you are pretty familiar with that, where you select the sidechain, the audio input's going to come from, in my case, the kick, right? You guys have probably done that as a creative workflow. Same type of idea, Mike, in Logic, where you select the key from another track, and all of that. What I'm talking about is the ability to shape, using the EQ, what the threshold is listening to. So just like when I select this sidechain and pick a track, that track is coming into my compressor and the threshold is listening to that track. The compression is now applied to everything else going through the compressor, but that track is just for my threshold to listen to, right? Like, that's how that works. You guys have probably used that, so you understand that concept. So I can take that a step further and say, I want to actually shape what my threshold is listening to using an EQ. The compression is still going to work on everything, just like when I click on the sidechain, but I can adjust how the threshold is listening. Now, the one actual implementation of this that I like is in combination with, if you're using it in this traditional way that you guys are probably familiar with, one of the first things people in Ableton learn is how to sidechain, right? Bass sidechain on the bass, pulling the kick rhythm, right? But if you combine that with a little bit of EQ and take out some of the low end, what happens is you can more finely adjust your attack and release to the input or to the compression that's happening. Now, the reason why is that by removing some of the low end, you're taking away some of that really loud, long waveforms and allowing the listening circuit or the threshold to listen to a shorter, brighter type signal. So if we want to see how this is in interaction and played out, I'm going to actually put it on my bass and then show you how this happens. This is the tuned 808. I think I have a bass line up here. Wrong track. Okay, that's not it. Let me find my bass line. Ah, all right. We'll try this. Somehow I got my kick on that track. All right, so let's take a look at this synth, for example. If we want to see how the interaction of this, I'll default these. So I set my sidechain from my kick. So you see how the gain reduction, or in other words, the compressor is reacting to the signal that the sidechain is listening to. That's coming from my kick. Like I said, we know that, we've seen that, right? And when we hit here, we can hear, so we're monitoring that input, right? So there's my kick. Now there's a lot of low end in that kick, right? So if I add the EQ and take some of that out, it's just shaping what the threshold is listening to, but what the threshold is listening to is now a nice tight little click to get its rhythm from. Here, the length. So notice how what you hear is a lot longer of a sound, right? With no EQ on here, that's just a straight kick, and that low end makes it a longer sound. We notice the gain reduction lasting longer. When I take some of that low end out, it's a much shorter result. So I can now use my release to kind of shape things if I want a little bit differently. And so this is one practical sort of implementation of this sidechain EQ. The other thing is if I want to shape how the EQ is listening, or sorry, how the compressor is listening, to just, manufacture a little bit different amount of compression based on frequency, I can also, sort of emphasize some mid-range frequencies if I want. And the compressor is just going to be listening to that area. And so all of these basic EQ choices are ways that you can shape what the threshold is listening to, not the output. So if I turn off this monitor is allowing me to listen to the result of this EQ. But regardless of where I set this up, so my output isn't changing here, right? But only what the threshold is listening to. So that's just sort of a way that you can take your compression usage a little bit of a step further when you want. when it comes to this peak and RMS, it's really handy to take a look at this input, the input meter here, because it shows us peak and RMS. So the peak is the top. Notice how those little bars at the top of this waveform. The darker green is the RMS input. So notice if I'm set at RMS and I don't bring my threshold low enough, we'll see no gain reduction. But as soon as I get below my RMS meter, which is the little darker green here, now we'll see a little bit of gain reduction. If I switch it to peak, I'm well below my peaks. I've got a lot of gain reduction. So that's that interaction and also the ability to see. So by looking at what my input is, I can see the peak in RMS, and it can help me set these thresholds accordingly, however I might, want, I guess. All right, so that's that, going through this stuff pretty quickly in terms of what the numbers mean, or the parameters mean. And now let's take a little bit more intricate look at the attack. So if we look at right here, what I'm showing here is the result of compression settings with a 10 millisecond attack and a 1 millisecond attack. And the way this PDF printed, it sort of put a lot of space between the picture and the words. Sorry about that. But you can see the end result where the first part of this sample here uh, is louder than the first part of this one. So the 1 millisecond attack time starts the compression sooner. So this is what I mean by that shaping of the sound. So a slower attack allows me to emphasize the first part of a sound. This is an example of just using a snare. And a faster attack time allows me to pull down the first part more of a sound. So that's how I can think about a sound. I can listen to a snare sound and I can think to myself, oh, you know what? I want more impact. I want more, front power out of that snare. So I can set a compressor to help me achieve a little bit more of that by understanding what milliseconds mean and how that works. So here's an example of that snare drum zoomed in, and this is 10 milliseconds. Sorry. So again, these are some pieces of compression that took me years before I actually figured out and got an understanding of what that actually meant. Like I never knew like what, I don't know, 10 milliseconds. I just made the compressor as fast as it could go all the time and I didn't quite know what I was doing, but you know, now that I understand a little bit, I can, see what's going on. The cool thing about me showing you this picture is that you can test this for yourself and you can get to know it and, listen, look at what this might mean. Because when I make a selection, if we look down here in the bottom left of the screen in Ableton on this screenshot, you can see that this is showing me the duration. And the duration is 0.010. Now, that is 10 milliseconds. That's the time definition of 10 milliseconds. So 0.010 is 10 milliseconds. So you can, zoom in and make some selections on some pieces of audio to help solidify your knowledge of what milliseconds mean in terms of attack and release. Look at what 100 milliseconds would mean. This is 10 milliseconds. So 10, 20, 30 millisecond attack on a sound like a snare is too late, right? It's not even going to do anything, barely, right? So it helps to put some context in. So I wanted to show you this selection and then show you how you can look at it and zoom in on some of your waveforms and look at some things you want to apply compression to and look at, what it is you're trying to do and, select the beginning, zoom in and select the beginning of the sound and look at what that is. And then you can, see what 2 milliseconds looks like and how fast the attack is going to start on a compressor and all of that. So now what I've got here is some usage settings and some examples and some ways of putting all of this knowledge of the knobs themselves into practice in some, general ways and some actual ways that I'm using these tools in my projects. So this first basic compression setting, it accomplishes a lot of dynamic control duties. It's sort of the go-to kind of simple. What my goal is, I'm looking for about 3 to 7 dBs of gain reduction, depending, somewhere right around there. My threshold, I'm setting it a little bit below the input, and um, you know, I'm trying to get a few dBs of gain reduction. So even if I'm using Logic, I can look at the gain reduction meter to set my threshold. The attack is usually somewhere around 1 to 5 milliseconds, 1 to 4 milliseconds. Release time around 2 to 400, somewhere in there. My ratio, I'm somewhere around 4, 5, somewhere around there. Knee about 5 or 6. Makeup gain usually ends up to be somewhere around 2 to 4 dB, and the dry wet is set at 100%. So this is my sort of basic compression setting that I'm going to use if I'm just sort of like, yeah, I just want to rein in this thing a little bit. I'll sort of, go for these type of settings. Now, the thing that's important is these first couple of lines, really, because when I research compressors, you hear people say, oh yeah, 4 to 1, you know, whatever, 5 millis, the tack release and all that. But I never quite knew what I was going for in the end result. So how to set the input is important. So I'm looking at the input and I'm just going to set it a little bit below the input, and I'm trying to achieve a few dBs of gain reduction. That's my sort of standard dynamic control. Another way that I'm using compression in my sort of second most popular way of using compressors is this sort of analog texture compression. And what I'm doing is I'm setting up my compressor to work on the very first part of the sound. So if we look at this, either this sample or back here, where we see the result of the little bit slower release, a little bit faster, or slower attack, faster attack. Notice how the faster attack is tightening up the front of this sound. So I have this way of using compressors that I'm been using a lot, uh, especially making that transition from the analog world and tons of analog gear at my disposal to being more and more in the box. I've started to be able to use compressors in this way, where this sort of softening or smoothing some of the transients or the front parts of sounds gives me a nice roundness that is pleasing to me on the sound. Now, what this sort of plays into is this basic fundamental understanding of the analog world, transistors and transformers that were involved in signals passing through pieces of gear. And what they kind of inherently did was a little bit of this. There was a little bit of this rounding of the transients, a smoothing out of some of the sharp parts of sounds that a little bit combined over a whole bunch of tracks gave analog this warm sound. It gave it this pleasing, not harsh sound. And in the early days of digital, people, didn't quite understand what was going on, but the inherent nature of analog versus the inherent nature of digital, and people were like, digital sounds so harsh. It's like digital is just capturing everything. Analog was inherently doing something that was nice. Now we fast forward 20 years and we understand that. And so now I can actually use a compressor to kind of help me do a little bit of that. So a little bit of that shaping on the front part of the sound, and I use compressors like this a lot. What I'm going for is just a couple dBs of gain reduction, 1 or 2 dBs, and it's going to happen fast. So my attack time is almost as fast as it can go. My threshold is just a couple dBs below the input. My ratio is a little bit closer to 4. I want zero knee. I don't want to spread out what I'm listening to. I want to be very determined about what I'm listening to. And my makeup gain 1 or 2 dBs. I really love this analog compression type setting. Fast attack, fast release, going for a couple dBs of gain reduction, and watch what happens to claps, snares, hats, things that are, or even like lots of Serum patches. It works really well. Serum is a very digital synth, which is very precise and has very amazing sound quality to it. But sometimes that precision and can be kind of sharp, and so it can be nice to sort of rein that in a little bit with just this sort of analog texture compression. So um, I like using this type of sound. The next way that I'm using a compressor is a way that sort of has a little bit more compressed signal that I use the mix knob to mix in. So I'm sort of doing a parallel compression where I've got a little bit of the dry signal, a little bit of the wet signal. And so I'm adjusting kind of how that goes, but that gives me the ability to do some things a little differently that can enhance the texture of a sound. So as much as I talked about this analog texture compression that's sort of working on the top down gently, but just sort of rounding the edges and the transients or the attacks, the first parts of those sounds, This using parallel compression is another way to put a little bit different sounding texture on things. But the way that I'm setting this up is that I can set the threshold pretty low, so like 10 to 20 dBs below the input. The takt time is pretty fast. The release time is moderate, 100 to 250 milliseconds. My ratio is fairly drastic in that it's about 8 or 10 to 1, right? So that's pretty significant. So in other words, if you can just, based on what I explained, looking at these numbers, I'm hoping in your mind you can see this is going to be a pretty fast acting, a lot of compression is going to be happening. A little bit of knee here is fine, but you don't even really need it because the threshold is so low. It's going to be compressing a lot. I don't really use much makeup gain. Sometimes you have to dial that in, but it just depends what you're going for. And then the dry wet, I adjust, and that is a way of putting some texture, an overcompressed signal in, kinda, to the more clean sound. And this is a way of doing it that is not so crunchy or distorted, but it's a way of having like some dynamic control, but the appearance of less dynamic control by using it in parallel. And these are some example settings. And play with these and see the difference and see if you can hear the difference. Taking this a step further is a way where I'm using this in parallel in what's sort of affectionately known as this New York drum bus compression, which basically started back in these, I don't even know who started it, but some, mixer in New York was using compressors in this way, where the idea is that there was a very compressed, very distorted sound that was mixed back into, and it was used mostly in like a live drum scenario. So it was a very over-compressed sound that got mixed back into the normal, sound. So this is a way of taken this sort of texture that I talked about to another level, right? So this setting, this way of setting a compressor for this type of thing, this type of approach, this type of texture, is really the original saturation plugin. It's the original thing before there were things like saturation plugins. So of course we have not lots of tools. Decapitator from Sound Toys. We've got 3 different tools in Ableton from the saturators, and we got guitar amps to the extreme saturation. We have, all kinds of different tools at our disposal. Free ones like the saturation knob from Softube. There's, tons of plugins that will do that. But oftentimes for me, I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna set it up the way I know and worked on Timeless Records. So this overcompressed sound is possible because the threshold is really low, the attack is as fast as possible, the release is very, very fast, 2 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds, or even as fast as it goes. The ratio is pretty high. You don't need any knee because the ratio is so low, right? It's minus, like, super low. And then just sort of mix it in. So I'm going to just try to apply a couple of these just so you can see some of the settings. I'm not sure that you'll really be able to hear the net result. You'll probably have to more play with it in your own listening environment. I'm not sure how good this is going to be over Zoom. But for this example setting, especially this dirty one, if I was to set up this compressor to do that, for example, on this synth keys that we've been playing for a second here, we're talking about a pretty high ratio from the notes. The attack time was very fast, and the release time was very fast, all the way 2 milliseconds, somewhere like that. Don't need any knee. And then I'm bringing the threshold down pretty low, like down to 40. So if I play without anything, we hear that normal synth sound. I'll turn it up a little bit. And if I put this all the way, you can hear how it's now really crunchy and distorted. Doing a combo of the two is a way of putting some texture, saturation on something, yet letting some of its dry signal through, right? So I'm using this type of an idea quite a bit on sounds where I think, oh, that sound is just pretty and clean, and I want to kind of dirty it up a little. So I can set a compressor like this. Now this setting makes it really crunchy. We can hear that. If I turn up the output or the makeup gain, you can hear how distorted that compression setting is. If I take a step back in my example settings where I was talking about just this parallel compression that can offer dynamic control but be a little bit more transparent, the key here is in the release. So the main difference here is the threshold's a little bit higher, but mainly it's the release that's slower, and it's that slower release that lets that has it be not as distorted. So as I move the release later, you'll see how it now starts to get less distorted. So the first example of that parallel compression is, dialing this type in. So it's not a very distorted compressor, but it's dynamic control, but it's going to feel like less dynamic control because you're sort of mixing it in. You're letting some of the dry signal through and sort of mixing between the two. Make the attack or make the release really fast, and now it's distorted and crunchy, and now you have this texture. And there's sort of some ways that I'm, using a compressor to sort of help me deal with the shaping of a sound. When I talked about the analog type compression, um, if I wanted to try this on, say, this snare, I don't know why that's not playing, but all right, I'll try something else then. Let's see, what else do I got that I can do? Maybe a hat would be nice. I think I have some more. Oh, let's see here. This group, maybe that's why this wasn't working. Yeah, there we go. So when I talked about that analog, I'll show you the setting I was referring to. Analog texture compression, right? So my goal is going to be a couple of dBs of gain reduction. I'm going to set the threshold just a couple dBs below the input. I'm going to have a fast attack because I want to address the front part of that sound. I want to soften the attack. My release is going to be pretty fast, 60 to 90 milliseconds. My ratio will be about 4. I'm not going to use a knee because I want to just really set that threshold exactly where I want. And then my makeup gain, maybe a dB or two based on how much of the gain reduction I'm seeing. So I'm going to set this up with that approach. So I'll do about a 4-to-1 here. I'll have my attack super fast. My release will be in this sort of 50, 60 millisecond range. I'm working off of peaks. I want no knee. And then I'll adjust this thresholds. I'll leave auto makeup on so you can hear the result a little bit, but that's what I don't like about auto makeup, is it gets too loud. So I can barely hear this in my headphones. So you might not be able to hear this at all. This is the setting I'm going for. What I'm listening for is the very front part getting a bit softer. It's going to happen very quickly, but again, it's this subtle thing, and it's a way that I'm using compressors a lot. If I feel like the sound itself feels a little bit sharp, feels a little bit, I don't know, if it's harsh is the word, but feels a little bit sharp, feels a little bit pointy, feels a little bit fast, and I want to kind of address it. Usually on things that are like more towards the high end. So it also works pretty good sometimes on hats, depending on where the sample came in, what it was from. Let's see this tambourine. This already has it on the stem level, so you're not going to hear much happening there. Let's see here. I think this is an example of some of this. Yeah, so this sound I basically already did that to. I can hear it. So, but the end result on this is where I can hear, if I sort of imagine the shape of that clap over time, and even if I was to go and look at it, this is going to be the end result of a little bit of that type of compression where it's working really fast, it's there's not a lot of attack on these sounds, right? So it's like it's a little bit rounder on the front. So it's a way to create a little bit of this, smoother sounding top part of a sound. So there's, a couple of those example settings put into play in terms of how I set them up and what that, what kind of what I'm going for and how it starts to impact a bit on the end result. And so I think, between these five little example settings, the cheat sheet, and the understanding of the knobs themselves, you'll be able to more, intentionally set the compression. Think about the sound that's happening. Think about what's traveling over time of that particular piece, and decide whether it needs that sort of traditional dynamic control, like that game of whack-a-mole I was talking about, that reining it in a little bit, or the maybe some of these more shaping texture ideas. But I'm oftentimes using compression to do that. Especially now that most compressors in the digital realm have this sort of dry wet, where we can do these parallel types of compression right there within the plugin. So that's pretty handy. So some people also talk about master compression, master bus compression. So I'm going to take a look at a couple example settings from that perspective. And so again, we're looking at what we're going for, this sort of like master bus slash sort of glue compression. There's two basic settings. Now, one of the settings uses the sidechain EQ, which we talked about already. So hopefully you remember that. But the sidechain EQ is what's important in this master bus setting number 2. And this is a more contemporary version because the SSL master bus compressor didn't have a sidechain EQ. So these were the settings that were sort of oftentimes used on the SSL bus compressor. The net result was what people call glue. What does glue mean? I always heard that term, and I even would say it for a long time before I knew, like, what does that mean? Like, what am I listening for? What does it do to the sound? So I'm going to try to put a little bit of definition on this for you in terms of how I hear it, and then play with it and see how you hear it. So real quick, before I go through the settings, is that I'm listening to the track, and I'm hearing without the glue compressor set or the bus compressor set to add that sort of glue, right? I'm listening to the sound, and I'm hearing all of the individual mids and high elements, and they're working individually, and I hear them happening at their own rhythm, and they're kind of doing their thing. With a little bit of this sort of master bus compression, the sort of glue sound, what I hear now is that they start to sound less individual, the mids and highs, and they start to kind of more feel like they're working together. So that's how I sort of listen for what is glue. Hopefully that can, make sense to you. Try it out and see. But ultimately, what you're listening for, what I'm listening for mainly, is that sort of mids and highs, separation and difference, of the attacks and all the different programming that's happening between all the high end stuff, and then all of a sudden, with a little bit of this sort of master bus slash glue compression on, it starts to now work a little bit more like one group. And then I think that's what they mean by gluing the track, or master bus glue compression. So here's a couple of settings that I'm going to walk through. The first one is we're trying to achieve just a couple dBs of this compression. The threshold is just a couple dBs lower than the input. The attack is about 30 milliseconds, which we saw on the screen is a little bit late in time when we showed that. The release time is pretty fast, 100 to 200 milliseconds or so. The ratio, we're going for about 2. The knee, we're using none, and the makeup gain is a couple of dBs equal to the amount of compression. But again, we're just going for this couple of dBs. So that's the sort of traditional way master bus compressions setting number 1. Master bus compression setting number 2, the key here, as I said, we use the sidechain EQ. We set the high pass filter at about 2 to 350, somewhere right around in there. So what that's doing, right, is it's removing the low end. So the threshold is listening to less low end. Therefore, the compression is reacting less to the low end, specifically the bass and the kick. So the compressor is going to work a little bit more on the mids and highs to offer that glue sound like I was talking about. We're still setting the threshold about the same, a couple dBs below the input. The attack time now can be a little bit faster. And that's the two main differences. This first one, it needed a slower attack time so that the kick wasn't causing the compressor to react too much. The kick is usually the loudest part, right? And so what they did on the console is they made the attack time a little bit later so that the kick would come through in its long and wide waveform and loudness that we know the low end does, because this is now the 7th time I've said it in 2 days, 3 days. So that's how they set it up. But now in the digital realm, we can use the sidechain EQ to get rid of that low end. Now we can bring the attack time a little bit faster. So now we're using a 10 millisecond attack time on that, about the same release time. Ratio is still just a couple of dBs ratio, 2.5 or whatever. No knee again, and the makeup gain also is equivalent to how much gain reduction we're seeing. Just a couple of dBs usually will even that out. So I'll show you these two in practice. Certainly, they're a pretty subtle listening experience. So, will you be able to totally hear what's happening over Zoom headphones? I don't know, but the idea, hopefully, it'll make sense if you start to play around with it. Is what I'm listening for is those mids and highs feeling like they're individual pieces, and then they just sort of start to kind of work more together. Is what is how that's working. So, if I take a look at where do I have it? Here's one. That's that one. Oh, it's the same. All right, so let me make sure that my snare is back to normal. Check this rest of these example tracks so nothing's getting weird. That's what was making that guy sound messed up. Let's take that off. So now that should be bass. Yeah, that's what it was. Okay. Oh, we have a rogue clap. So before I put this on, I want to make sure this is back from my example settings. And this is what it was. This has got to come back. Yeah. All right. Oops. All right, so if I look at that first setting, I talked about the attack being about 30 milliseconds. The release is about 200 milliseconds. So for this example, as you see, I'm using the glue compressor in Ableton. Now, remember I was using those terms glue. Remember I was saying how the glue compressor refers to the SSL bus compressor, and now we see what's actually called the glue compressor. Well, this glue compressor was made by a guy who modeled it after the SSL bus compressor. So this is a great choice. I love this compressor. I own this as a separate product and use it in other DAWs, and so I use it a lot if I'm working in here. But certainly for this purpose, as a master bus glue compressor, it's actually literally designed for that. So these are the settings that I would use. So the 30 millisecond attack, and oh, okay. The other thing is this took me a while to figure out, but on the glue compressor, when we look at the release time numbers, this 0.1 is 100 milliseconds. So the fastest release time that the glue compressor can offer us is 100 milliseconds. 200 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds, 800 milliseconds, 600, 800, 1 second, right? So 100 milliseconds is the fastest release time the glue compressor can offer. When we looked at the normal compressor, we see how the release time, if this is 100 milliseconds is equivalent to this 0.1 that the glue offers us. But on this on the normal compressor plugin, we can get release time of 1 millisecond. Why that's important is that like if you're trying to do, for example, my New York drum bus compression setting, you're not going to be able to with the glue compressor because it won't get distorted. Remember when I showed you how I took my release time from super fast and it was real crunchy and distorted, and as I slowed the release time and got to 100 milliseconds, it was now much smoother sounding? Well, you can't use the glue compressor to get that distorted because that distortion, that craziness lies in the fast release time. So that's just how that goes, right? So we have to use the other compressor for that. But that's what these numbers mean. So zero point 0.1 means 100 milliseconds on the glue compressor. So I'm going to shoot for about 2 milliseconds, or 0.2, so 200 milliseconds release time. My ratio is going to be 2 to 1, and this is the setting right off of what I was talking about. So I bring the threshold to show myself just a couple dBs of gain reduction. I bring my makeup gain to be about, the equivalent of half of that or so. So even on these headphones, if I think about the way I described how I listen to this, I can hear it a little bit. Again, I'm going to describe it. I hear the hi-hat in the top part and the front part of that clap and snare and the brightness in some of those vocal bits, and they all sound like they're all individual, and it's a pretty damn good sounding mix. But then when I put the glue compressor on, all that mids and high stuff just starts to kind of work a little bit more together. And that's what I'm listening for. That's the sort of idea behind bus compression. So that's without it, and I'll turn it on. Like I said, you may or may not be able to hear that, but that's what I'm shooting for. That's how I'm trying to listen to it. I'm trying to hear what it's happening up there on the mids, and the highs. The other thing that I do here with this setting is that it offers a little bit of tightness to the low end. And if we think about that in terms of the setting, the compression, and what's going on, the way sound is moving, and we're compressing it, looking at like when I showed that diagram of the snare and the compression, we've got 30 milliseconds. So we're letting the kick to come through 30 milliseconds. Then we have just a little bit of compression happening. So what's happening is we're sort of tightening up some of the length around that kick. So we have the kick and then a little bit of compression, kick and a little bit of compression. So it just feels a little bit more um, tighter, a little bit more controlled, I guess you'd say. So there's a slight little bit of that happening as well. So that's kind of how I listen and what I'm thinking about it. Now, if I take a look at that example setting for bus SAS glue compression, the setting number 2, I said the important part is we're getting rid of the low end, so the detection circuit or the threshold is listening to less low end. And as a result, we have a little bit more room to play with the attack time. So we can bring the attack time down a little bit faster to 10 milliseconds, shooting for about the same amount of gain reduction. And I use about the same makeup gain. Yeah, I can barely even hear that on my terrible headphones as we're doing this, but the idea is the same. It's what I'm going for and what I'm listening for is that little bit of togetherness that occurs on the mids and highs. We notice how this compression setting, it is moving a little bit faster. We can see there's a little bit more compression happening because we're focusing in the compressors listening to the more mids and highs because we've removed some of the lows via this filter here, right, the sidechain EQ. So that's kind of a couple of ways of setting up this glue compressor. And the important part about the glue compressor, as I said, is the release time is this is 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds. So those milliseconds should make a little more sense to you after seeing kind of what that means in terms of tempo and rhythm and quarter notes and 16th note and 8th notes. And you can refer back to that chart, but that's, kind of how that works. So from here now, we take a look at multiband compressors, right? So now that we've covered compressors, we think, okay, what's the deal with multiband compressors? Well, My estimation is that once you understand how to control a regular compressor, it sort of demystifies a multiband compressor. So when I first started looking at a multiband compressor was before I really knew and understood regular compressors. I'd been using them, but like most of us, I was haphazardly moving knobs on the compressor and hoping for a result that I thought sounded good, but not quite knew what I was doing, but followed some advice and did some stuff that I thought was right. And then all of a sudden in the digital realm, we now had multiband compressors. Yes, I was around before there were multiband compressors making music, and now all of a sudden I have them. So I didn't quite know what to do or how to use them. But once I really understood compression, once I understood threshold, ratio, attack, release, knee, peak, RMS, all those type of settings, now I can look at any multiband compressor. I can sort of translate the names that they're called and what the numbers mean and know how to set the compression. A multiband compressor is basically just several compressors that allow you to define certain frequency ranges for that compressor to work. So, FabFilter makes multiband, Waves makes multiband, there's multibands in Logic, and of course, multibands in Ableton. The idea is the same, the settings are the same and work the same. Threshold, ratio, attack, release. The peak RMS is how it's listening, average versus peaks, and all of that. The difference is now we have the ability to separate those compressors in that one plugin to work just across a certain frequency range. So the key thing here is that people say, well, when would I use a multi-band compressor? Well, if I'm doing, for example, just the snare, like we saw that snare picture, and I even pulled it up and showed you, the snare, if we think about the snare itself, it represents a certain amount of frequency range, and a decent amount of frequency range, but it's fairly constant over time. It's like, it's rare that a clap that's playing 2 and 4, or a hi-hat is changing its frequency range representation over time. It's usually like it's the same set of frequencies that are occurring at once. Clap 2 4, ba ba ba. It's the same set of frequencies. So there's not really much of a frequency difference dynamically in between each of those hits, right? So there's no real usual need to use a multi-band compressor necessarily on a normal snare or hat or whatever. Now, when I would use a multi-band compressor is when something is different dynamically across the frequency range, because a multi-band compressor allows me to set different compressors for different frequency ranges. So a vocal is a prime example of this, like somebody singing verses and choruses. They sing louder in the chorus, they might sing brighter and higher in the chorus. That's different frequencies, different dynamic control. The lower parts, and maybe even a whisper part in the bridge, is going to be lower in frequency and also potentially lower in volume or different in volume. And so a multi-band compressor is a great usage when it comes to controlling things like vocals or sounds that are changing dynamically over the course of time and across the frequency range. So if they're changing over the course of frequency range and the dynamics are different, then you can use a multiband compressor to set certain frequency ranges and compression settings that will do what they're supposed to do across those different frequency ranges. And so that's the important distinction in terms of like demystifying when to use a multiband compressor. Like just because it's there, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all that useful. Like if I'm just trying to compress like I said, a hat or a kick or something that's basically the same frequency each time, and I want to put some dynamic control onto it, I'll just use a normal compressor. But when the sound is changing and the dynamics are changing over the frequency, that's when I'm going to jump into using a multi-band compressor. So um, with that in mind, I did a little bit here of when I was setting up the compressor, I was showing you the settings where I would set the compression. I would talked about how to set the makeup gain, and then I would turn the compressor off, turn it on, and adjust the makeup gain. I kind of just sort of did it a couple times, and I instinctually just sort of do that. Um, but it's important to sort of think. I think it's important to think about that mainly because my whole mindset of everything I do when it comes to mixing is being very intentional about it. And so I'm always thinking like, okay, if I think I want to apply a compressor to this for some particular reason, whatever that reason is, I'm going to do it and apply it, but then I'm going to make some adjustments to that makeup gain, which I talked to you about how I think about setting that, right? I look at the amount of gain reduction and then I put, about half of that back in makeup gain. But then the next thing I'm going to do is bypass, turn it back on, bypass, turn it back on, make adjustments to that makeup gain. Then I'm going to switch my brain and go, okay, I was listening to before and after level. Now I'm going to listen to before and after impact. So it's sort of two ways of listening. So I set my compressor the way that I think I want it. I go for it. I think it's cool. Maybe even set that in solo or whatever. And then I set my makeup gain. I bypass. I set my makeup gain. I turn it on, turn it off. Then I go, okay, now I'm going to try to hear what it's doing. And so I make that transition and start to really listen to the impact of what I set, make sure that what I set was right, that I like it, that it's making it better, and then I can move on. And oftentimes I remember to take a listen to the impact of what I did, not just in solo, but in context of everything else. And I know that when we talk tomorrow about EQ, I'm going to make a huge point about making sure to not just be EQing in solo. In fact, I'll say it tomorrow, but I'll say it here because it's important. Nobody cares what your parts sound like in solo. They only care what your parts sound like together as a whole. So as much as I'm going to listen to and apply a compression in solo to really, adjust it and see what I'm doing and kind of feel like I know the settings are right, I'm going to also make some informed decision about that, listening to it in context of everything else also. So just a little ploy to do that. Now, I put this little link in here because I thought it was very cool and very useful. And this Vintage King website breaks down the three types of main compressors out there in the real world, the three types of the most sought after expensive compressors that have been used time and time again. There's about 3 to 4 examples for each of these three types that cover the 12 most widely used and sought after compressors out there. And I feel like it will offer you, having gone through what we went through today, a completely different read when you look at what the most famous FET compressors are, the most famous optical compressors are, what made them, why people used the an 1176 on the bass, what it was about the attack time and the ratio and the release time on that, what made an LA2A great for vocals, because that the fastest attack time you could have was 2 milliseconds, so it was nice on vocals to let a couple milliseconds through. There's just some cool things about the understanding of the numbers, the milliseconds, the attack threshold release, and then to sort of, have the opportunity to take a look at some of these, sought after compressors, what made them dope, what people liked about them, how they worked, what was famous about them, what made them famous, but then also think about that in terms of the numbers and the knobs that we have today, because some of that can be kind of fun and useful to sort of parse and sort of see how it makes sense to what you're doing in your normal workflows. So I know I don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm hoping that your knowledge of compression is just increased by at least an hour and a half worth of education, if not more. And with that, is there any further discussion needed as we slowly wind up our last couple of minutes? Any part I went over too quickly that's you want a little bit more of?
I do have one question about the master bus number 2, how you
Okay.
sidechain it to the EQ.
Yep.
What EQ would you set? Like, is it EQ'd on the master or just overall? You know what I mean?
You're looking at my screen right now?
Yeah.
So it's the EQ, this EQ sidechain of the compressor, which is basically this filter for what the
Oh,
threshold is listening to.
I understood that part, but the part.
That's it. That's the sidechain.
Oh, okay.
It's the
Oh,
side. It's the
okay.
sidechain EQ part of this compressor. And,
Oh,
and
except for a
there's a
high filter around 2. Oh, okay. I got it.
yeah. So and there's a reason why I put in here when I say where is it? Sidechain EQ. It's not what you think it is. Anyway, I can't find it, but it's somewhere in the notes where I say, sidechain EQ on compression, it's not what you think it is. Because when I say sidechain for, sidechain compression, people go, "Oh yeah, I know what that is," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about." I'm
Yeah.
talking about how we can use that EQ as a side chain. So in other words, adjust how the compressor is listening. So it's just what
Yeah.
the threshold is listening to. You're either having it listen to the kick track or some other track to decide when to compress, or we're shaping the input. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah.
You have time for another question?
Make it quick.
What about when you drag in like a sample from like your sample pack, or if you're a producer working with like a kick from somebody that's already done like a mastered sample pack or whatever?
So the way I look at it is this: like in those type of cases, I'm placing it, and if I'm placing it at the same volume, I probably don't need compression, right? I mean, because compression is going to even out the differences in the dynamic range. But if it's the same every time, there's no difference in dynamic range. I may want to shape how it appears over time. I may want to soften the front part of that kick or snare or hat. I may want to accentuate the front part of that kick, snare, or hat. So I may think about that second way of using compression, where I talked about how I want to shape it over time. So I might use it in that way, but that's how I'm gonna think about it. Like I was saying, MIDI program parts, when we adjust the velocity, we're sort of adjusting the dynamic range because we're making there not be a difference between first hit, second hit, third hit, fourth hit, or we're making that difference how we want it, right? If it's too much, we can use a little compression. But if it's just a kick that gets brought in from a sample pack that's like boom, 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 there's not much dynamically necessarily to change. But you may want to change how it happens over its time, right? So again, we saw that snare example in the document where I showed a slow attack on that snare accentuated the front part of it. So the compression and the attack time affects the excitement of a sound. So I might say this snare sample is cool, but I want more excitement. So I'll put some compression on it with a little slower attack time. I'll hear a little bit more of the front part of that snare and feel like it has more impact. That may be how I want to use it and shape it. But other than that, the generic, if it's a sample, it's in and done.
Gotcha. Thanks.
All right. That's it. You'll get the video. You'll get the notes. And boom. Yeah. See you tomorrow. Bye.